Member Morrison.
Thank you, Speaker. It's my privilege to rise today on behalf of the NDP caucus to join Indigenous leaders, members of Aboriginal communities and people across Canada in calling for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Last May, we learned from the RCMP that almost 1,200 Indigenous women and girls in Canada have been murdered or gone missing since 1980. Indigenous women are 3 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to report being a victim of a sexual crime, and 4 times more likely to be murdered. These are mothers, daughters, sisters, aunties, and friends who have been failed by our system, their lives devalued. They have been failed by a justice system that incarcerates them for poverty, by a health system that ignores their lived experiences, and by a social service system that stigmatizes and abandons them. Their families have been failed by our collective refusal to acknowledge the reality of what is happening to Indigenous women and girls, by our complicity in blaming individual victims or their communities, and by our unwillingness to hold governments to account. This is a national tragedy and a national shame. These women may not be high on the radar of the federal Conservative government, but they deserve to have their stories told. Their families deserve the closure and the healing that a national inquiry can bring. Their communities deserve a pan-Canadian coordinated effort to end the violence and prevent the harm. Speaker, last week, the Legal Strategy Coalition on Violence Against Indigenous Women released a report on 58 studies that have been conducted into missing and murdered Indigenous women and the 700 recommendations that have been made. The report concludes that violence against Indigenous women is a sociological issue and that a national commission is desperately needed to understand why governments have resisted taking action. Speaker, this must not be a question of resources. Families of missing and murdered Indigenous women should not have to choose between the search for justice through an inquiry and the proactive, coordinated implementation of actions to address root causes. New Democrats stand with the families of these missing and murdered women to demand an independent national inquiry. We stand with all our sisters to call for a national dialogue to examine the structures of violence against Indigenous women and the way they intersect. But let me be clear, an inquiry is the beginning, not the end. It must be accompanied by formal commitments from both the federal and Ontario governments to act on the findings and implement the recommendations, just as we would demand if these women were white. Thank you.